Welcome, everyone, to today's webinar featuring Morgan Ortagus, discussing current foreign policy issues and why they're important when voting in the upcoming midterm elections. For those who don't know me, I'm Laurie Regan, Emmett's New York chapter president and board and advisory board member, and I'm very happy to be moderating our discussion this afternoon with Morgan. Emmett's work is critically important in the fight for Israel's survival and for a strong U.S. national security, both of which are integrally tied together. And I believe today's discussions will help provide insights on both of these important policy objectives. So I thank you all for joining and supporting Emmett's work. As always, I'll ask you to please follow us at www.emmettonline.org, and please consider making a financial donation. It's your support that enables us to continue our important work. Morgan Ortagus is the founder of Polaris National Security. She is an active U.S. Navy Reserve officer and a business executive. During the Trump administration, Morgan served at the Department of State as the spokesperson for the United States under then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. At the State Department, she worked closely with the White House on the historic Abraham Accords. Traveling with Secretary Pompeo to more than 50 nations, she coordinated messaging campaigns and responses to sensitive and high-profile foreign policy actions, from hostage negotiations to the U.S. campaign against Huawei 5G expansion in the West. She led U.S. government efforts to push back against sophisticated Chinese, Russian, and Iranian malign influence campaigns, and was instrumental in the United States' determination of the Chinese government's genocide against the Uyghurs. Morgan began her government service as a public affairs officer at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where she spent several months in Baghdad. She was an intelligence analyst at the U.S. Treasury in the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, and was assigned to Riyadh as the Deputy U.S. Treasury Attaché. Morgan was the principal liaison from the U.S. Treasury to the banking sector in Saudi Arabia. Many of you also probably recognize Morgan from her role as national security contributor for Fox News and her appearance on many Fox panels, including Special Report, Outnumbered, and Gutfeld. Today's webinar will be recorded and available for viewing at a later time. If you have a question you'd like to ask Morgan, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please don't put the questions into the chat feature because I won't be moderating those. And please also keep your commentary in the chat to a minimum. Welcome, Morgan, and thanks so much for being with us today. Before we get into the substantive discussions of foreign policy under the Biden administration, can you share with our audience why you founded Polaris and what exactly you and your organization are doing in the lead up to the midterms? I've always been quite frustrated over the lack of interest of the American public in foreign policy matters when they head into the voting booth. And I love your recognition of its importance and why candidates should be informed on these critical issues. Your former boss, Secretary Pompeo, noted that we live in a world where crime in America, the cost of staples like gasoline and bread, and securing our southern border, often thought of as domestic political matters, are genuinely dependent on foreign policy. So please tell us what it is that you're doing by recognizing this important concept. Morgan, I think you're muted.
You know, you'd think 3 years into the pandemic, I would have figured the unmute button. Thank you, Laurie, for having me. And thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope this is a fruitful and interesting discussion for all of us today. So at the end of the Trump administration, I actually had a baby 2 days after the election. So I was on maternity leave. And it was such a crazy 2 years working for Mike Pompeo. As you said, Laurie, I was in over 50 countries. I was international half the month. It's a miracle that I was able to get pregnant and have a baby, actually, during that time. But God certainly works in mysterious ways. And as I was coming out, I started to think of what I wanted to do next. And I knew I was going to have business ventures, which I do. But I thought, it's incredibly important to me to create a mechanism to talk about foreign policy and national security to average everyday Americans. What I've seen over the past 20 years in Washington and New York, where I primarily lived, is that the foreign policy community is quite small, it's quite insular, and there's a lot of groupthink. And there's this attitude that is really prevalent in the foreign policy community, whether you're a political appointee or whether you're a diplomat at the State Department. There's this sort of pejorative attitude towards the American people that foreign policy is so hard to understand. The world is such a complicated place. You silly little American voters don't need to worry about us. Let the experts, let us worry about foreign policy. And I think that we actually get, as a democracy, that's a very dangerous position to be in. Also, there's another thing that happens, and I think this happens in any industry, no matter what industry you're in, right? You get into industry speak, and you start talking in the language and the code words that only people within your industry or within your silo understand. And when I got to the State Department, and I started looking at the public statements that were supposed to go out under the name of the secretary and my name and coming out from the State Department, I just looked at this and I said, guys, I understand what this means, but no one else does. Like, what does this mean? And so I spent a lot of time with a big fat red marker trying to make our foreign policy sound like plain English, sound like something anybody can understand. I wanted my grandmother in Florida, cousins in Texas, the gas station owner in Topeka. I wanted anybody to be able to read a statement by me or Mike Pompeo and to understand Trump foreign policy and what we were doing and why. Now, I didn't always win that battle, but it was important to me. So what I wanted to do was to translate that outside of government and to help candidates especially talk about it. So, it's a passion of mine. It's one of the reasons, that I stay on television trying to talk about these national security issues. And it's actually a really good form of discipline, right? Because on TV, we're lucky if we have 4 minutes, right, to talk about a subject. So to try to take a really big picture issue and distill it down into TV sound bites is very similar to what a candidate needs to do on the campaign trail. And as you pointed out, Lori, and as my former boss, Mike Pompeo, said, things that you think are domestic politics, maybe, but they almost always have some sort of foreign policy component. What you're paying at the pump has a foreign policy component. The price of food has a foreign policy component. The impact of trade deals on jobs and on the Rust Belt, all has a foreign policy component. So what I've sought to do is to democratize something that has always been a cadre of elitists exercising, and conducting foreign policy. And one of the reasons I felt particularly passionate about democratizing it is because it is the gas station owner in Topeka. It is my cousins in Texas. I'm in the Navy Reserve still. It's average people around America that are fighting our wars and that are affected by them, right? Not normally the elite in Washington. And so I think that's maybe a long-winded answer, Lori, but that's the point, is we are trying to democratize foreign policy for every American to understand it, for every American to be bought into whatever the fight may be, whatever the issue of the day is, and to hold the Biden administration accountable for policies that I think are actually not helpful to our national security.
I think it's such important work, Morgan, and I'm so happy that you're doing it because, as I said, I've been frustrated, and hopefully the viewers at the end of this almost hour that we're going to have left to talk about these issues, you come away with the urgency that this is a voting issue. We need to start voting on these things. Mm-hmm. So, as you pointed out, those of us who spend our days focused on U.S. and Israeli national security view the Biden foreign policy positions today as, well, I would call them disastrous, but certainly problematic. There are many of them, and I'm going to try to cover as much ground as possible in the context of each area. I'd like us to focus on impact domestically and from a national security standpoint. Obviously, the right to an abortion, for instance, doesn't matter if terrorists are planning the next 9/11. So let's start with 9/11, which I think had both a huge impact on me and on you and the direction that our lives would take. So putting aside Biden's horrific comparisons of 9/11 to the January 6th riots and the comparison by Democrats of quote unquote MAGA Republicans to jihadi terrorists, all of which is gutter politics at its worst. And say what you will about whether we should or should not have gone into Afghanistan and Iraq. We were there. We had a modicum of control prior to the decisions on the part of the Obama-Biden administration, now the Biden-Harris policies. Why should Americans be upset that those foreign policy decisions, which are a hallmark of the Biden team, decisions including the disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal, handing it back to the Taliban that harbored Osama bin Laden and now once again provides a safe haven to Al-Qaeda, and basically handing Iraq over to Iran with ISIS now back on the scene? I mean, how do we get Americans to focus on, they were upset with the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, but not because of the impact that it has on our national security, more because I think the look of it. So how do we get Americans to focus on these issues, since it seems they've forgotten about the horrors of that September day 21 years ago?
That's something, this is such an interesting question. And I was actually started talking about this in the 2016 election, where I raised the flag and said, listen, guys, we have people that are enlisting and joining the military, or people who are going off to college who were either not born or were toddlers during 9/11, people that have no recollection of it. And I think that's a very weird thing for all of us, right? Almost all of us on this call know exactly where we were when we heard about the towers. And it fundamentally changed so much of our life. And it was a clarion call to, people like me and my friends to serve. And it's how I ended up in more war zones than I can count over the past 20 years. So I think that there is a generational challenge, and this is part of the reason I think it's hard to diagnose, but I think it's part of the reason that the military is having such problems with enlistment rates, right? Is there's not that solidifying experience that we all had as a nation around 9/11. Combining that with, I think, very, very dangerous rhetoric of telling young people that this is an awful nation that was actually founded on racist principles and this is a white supremacist nation. Well, if you tell young people that this country is so terrible, then why would they want to fight for it? And so I think, the bottom line is, if you're not willing to stand up for America at home, you'll never be willing to stand up for her abroad. And that's something that I think the Democratic Party, in my opinion, has lost sight of. So, going back to Afghanistan, I mean, listen, I have so many friends in the military. And it's one of the reasons why I'm involved in several charities related to, especially the guys that I've always supported in special warfare, the special forces guys. I have friends that have done so many tours in Iraq and Afghanistan that they lost count, right? Or I lost count of how many they've done. There's been such an undue burden placed on 1%, of the population of the country, and not everybody was in the fight together. So I think I agree with your assessment, Lori, that people were embarrassed whenever they saw what happened a little over a year ago. And I was heartbroken to watch the 13 dead. It's funny, I said the Lord works in mysterious ways earlier in the call when I was talking about my unexpected pregnancy during the craziest moment of my life. And thank God for her little Adina Ann, by the way. When you look at what was going on in August of that year when the 13 were killed, that was a soul crushing moment for any of us who worked on, Iraq and Afghanistan and those issues. And by the way, we did withdraw from Iraq during the Obama administration without the disasters that we saw unfold in Afghanistan. So it was certainly possible. But speaking of weird things happening, I had been vaccinated, obviously, and got COVID in that early Delta wave. And so I had to cancel several trips I was supposed to go on, and I was sitting at home quarantining. Me and my kiddo had COVID. But one of the graceful moments out of all of that is that it allowed me 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, actually, by the time we all got COVID and quarantined, to sit in my house and just work on getting people out of Afghanistan. And I was able to get one of my friends it was a very prominent lawyer in Kabul, and his entire family out, and just round the clock, right, work to get people out. And it was sort of, in the worst moment, and I think in modern political history, maybe other than 9/11, from a foreign policy perspective, I saw people just rally together to try to get Americans out, to try to get allies out, to try and do it and do what we can. So I actually think that is the moment too. If you look at it from a political polling perspective, I think that's the moment that everything went downhill for this country, because the people, and I'm not one of them, but the people who were old enough to remember the withdrawal from Vietnam and how history sort of, repeated itself with those eerily similar images. So listen, maybe I'm wrong on this. I do think it resonates with people. It probably resonates a lot more with the veteran community, and why I think, this country should have, much more of a call to national service. Now, I don't know how we get that, but somehow we have to get that call to national service that we had around 9/11.
You bring up a number of points. And first, I want to just say thank you for your service. And we need more Americans like you. I was going to ask you this a little bit later in the program, but as long as you have talked about on the military, we are seeing the numbers decrease in enlistment, and I find that a bit frightening. And
Yeah.
I think part of it, you touch on there's no really rallying call, and then of course we're indoctrinating generations with that America is horrible. But there's also this woke agenda and this focus that's intended to indoctrinate our soldiers, and it's emasculating the forces. So, there's this great video. I don't know how many people might have seen it, but it's contrasts the Russian military recruitment ad, which features a big, strong, scary man, men, and they're working out and they look tough and scary. And then you've got this U.S. Army recruitment ad, which is a colorful animation featuring a young woman whose parents are lesbians. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but that's not really how you're going to get people to join the military. So, what are your thoughts on this sort of wokeism that's infiltrated our Department of Defense?
I think it's dangerous, and there is also a massive disconnect between between the flag officers and everyone else, right? And especially in the enlisted, there's a big cultural disconnect. The Pentagon is also grossly bloated. I would love in the new Congress for us to slash literally half of the civilian employees at the Pentagon. I mean, there's so much, there's so many, corrupt and bloated bureaucracy there, which can, by the way, happen in any bureaucracy, and has definitely infiltrated the military on the people that are, career civil service, right, type people. I'm not talking about uniform military. So I think that there's definitely a disconnect. You probably have too many flag officers, too many brass in Washington that are trying way too hard to play politics, right? Listen, what's the point of the military? It's to keep America safe. The point of the military is to kill bad guys, right? And whenever I was commissioned as an intelligence officer, it's because I had an intelligence background. And at that point, I had gone into the private sector from the government, and I wanted to keep my foot in the door to help kill bad guys. So I'm sure there's people in here with much more success, who have been more successful at business than me. I've been in business. I'm probably newer to it than the rest of you, but anybody on here who has a business and who's been successful, we all know that. What are you selling? What's your brand, right? Who are you selling to? All of these are like crucial things. Like if I have a widget that I'm producing, who's going to purchase that widget? What's the profile of the person who wants to purchase said widget, right? And then you market and you build a brand that's going to appeal to that audience. So what I see is this attempt to try, and I get, and one way I sort of get it, because they're trying to appeal to younger people and a more diverse generation, and they're trying to figure out how to market to a generation that's very different probably than even my generation that had that formative experience around 9/11 as young adults. So in some ways I understand what they're trying to do, but at the end of the day, you can't market to people that don't want to necessarily sign up to kill bad guys and potentially give their life for their country, right? Like I know that if there's another war, I could get called up and I could lose my life, and I'm willing and ready and able to fight for that. I don't know that the type of person that they're trying to attract with these ads and with these campaigns has that same sentiment, and so what we really need to be focusing on is the fight against, that we may have to take against the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, we all hope it's like the Cold War and that you don't end up in a major power, struggle. Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot. That would be nice, but we're not guaranteed that's going to happen. And we're certainly not guaranteed that we're going to win. And so in my mind, that's what the military should be focused on, and it should be focused on attracting people who want to fight and die for their country and kill bad guys. And I don't really care what you do in your free time or what you look like or who you want to kiss, or I don't care about any of that. Do you want to fight and die for your country? And do you want to kill bad guys? And if you have a problem with either one of those, then I don't want you in.
Great response. Thank you, Morgan. And you bring up China. So let's talk about China. So again, turning to your former boss, Secretary Pompeo recently stated Take the Chinese Communist Party. Beijing may feel distant, but every leader running for federal office should explain why jobs in their community have been stolen by China. And then they should explain what they intend to do to bring them back and prevent the CCP from growing its economy on the backs of steelworkers in Pennsylvania or machinists in Wichita, Kansas. They should explain why they've done nothing to hold China accountable for a virus born in Wuhan, crushing our children's educations. Fentanyl from China now threatens every community and is destroying families. Do the politicians with whom you're speaking understand the threats that China poses to so many aspects of our security here at home? And how do we educate Americans that this should be yet one more voting issue? I'm going to just add, as we bring it back to Biden, his latest appointment to serve as Chief Climate Risk Officer for the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is a woman who studied at the CCP-controlled university that conducts research for the People's Liberation Army.
China built more coal plants than ever last year. And they have, listen, if you want to stop climate change, you've got to stop it through the Chinese and through the Indians, to be fair. And the Chinese Communist Party has no history of delivering on anything that they promise. If you go back to the Rose Garden press conference that Obama and Xi Jinping did in the Rose Garden in, I think it was 2015, and you go through this was right after the Chinese had hacked into OPM and got the security clearance information of me and plenty of others. And so they had a summit where the Chinese were supposed to get their hands slapped and stop stealing, information of our spies and people with security clearances. They were supposed to stop militarizing South China Sea. They were supposed to abide by their trade commitments. You could go down the list of things if you go back to that Rose Garden presser. And that is in more recent history, but you could look at the past 40 years that they don't live up to their promises. So I think the Biden administration is making a really big gamble. And Pompeo has said this before, and I think it's such a great way of describing it. Every administration, Republican or Democrat, comes in with a guiding set of principles that is supposed to guide all of their policy decision. Like, what is the organizing theme? For us in the Trump administration, the organizing theme was America first. So at the State Department, our mandate was, does this foreign policy, is it best for the American people? Does it advance the American people? Is this best for America? For the Biden administration, their guiding theme is climate change. So they are willing to make concessions and trade-offs, even on human rights, in order to get climate change concessions, which I think is incredibly dangerous to put all of your eggs in that basket, principally because the Chinese Communist Party has no intention of keeping good on their word that they give to John Kerry. I mean, it's like patently ridiculous. As I said, they're building more coal plants than ever. So we're not. I mean, when's the last time, maybe I'm being a little overly critical, but I can't remember the last time I saw a statement come out of Tony Blinken or the State Department about the ongoing genocide against Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang, right? I can't remember whenever I saw an American company say, you know what, like killing Muslims in Xinjiang and forcefully sterilizing women, forcing abortions, maybe that's a bridge too far. Maybe we won't do business over it, right? But no one, I mean, there's no moral authority to be had over it. So I say that to say that, Tony Blinken said in his confirmation hearing that their foreign policy was going to be led with human rights. Now, right before we got on this call, President Biden was speaking at UN General Assembly. I didn't get to hear the whole thing. Will, who works for me, is on the line and sent me a few notes. I'm going to watch it afterwards because it was conflicting with this call. But, my understanding is there was almost no talk. There's a lot of talk about climate change, very little talk about human rights. So, listen, the reality is just foreign policies in black and white. I get that. You have to make a lot of trade-offs. But we are, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, I mean, when you look across, we could go across the world, we are prioritizing climate change above, in my opinion, American national security. And
just to stick on with China for 1 second, I've read a lot recently about the Chinese government-related businesses that are buying up farmland in the U.S. very close to military bases. Do you have any insight on that? I mean, the Chinese it sounds like they're spying on us.
Well, they're certainly trying, right? Like, it's smart. I mean, it's not a stupid move from them, from their part. They're trying to get as close to, bases where we have nuclear warheads parked, and they know it. And they're, like you said, trying to build up farmland. I need to look. I know Will is on the line who works for me. I need to look. My husband used to be a lawyer on CFIUS, but I don't think that a lot of this actually goes through the CFIUS process. But it's listen, there can be absolutely no doubt. Like I don't know that I actually know the policies to remedy this. It's something I need to double check with on CFIUS. But you're absolutely right that there are nefarious intentions there. There's no good intentions. There's no reason why the Chinese Communist Party should be allowed to buy farmland near American bases where we house some of our most sensitive equipment and nuclear secrets. Like, come on. They're like, come on.
I'm venturing a guess that there's so much that goes on behind the scenes that we average Americans that are not involved in the intelligence agencies or State Department, have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. It's frightening. So Emmett, and I apologize to everybody that we are conflicting with the UN General Assembly today, and that for those that missed Biden's speech, it will be recorded, and as will Morgan's, webinar with us today, so we can all watch everything. Emmett's focused a lot of time and resources on fighting not just the initial JCPOA, but also Biden's seemingly obsessive quest to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal since day one of his presidency. I personally invested a great deal of my time to fighting the initial deal as well. But outside of a small circle, I don't see Americans caring about Iran or realizing what a tremendous threat it is, not just to our ally Israel, because we're all focused on Israel, but also to our country. Can you spend a few minutes talking about why Americans should be vociferously fighting the administration on re-entry to this deal? And I'll also add that I know Raisi spoke, I believe it was earlier today, this morning, and that, it's a huge effort to try to get the administration to refuse to give him a visa and therefore a platform. And instead, the administration allowed him to, to spout all the hate that Iran has at the UN this morning.
And it's not just that he was allowed in, it's people in his delegation that were allowed in. So for context, you can deny visas. We did that in the Trump administration. We limited who could come over from Iran. We made it very, very narrow parameters of who could come. And then the people that were allowed to come over had a several block radius. Now, I don't remember what it was, but it was probably like 10, 15 block radius around the United Nations. And so their visa had those travel restrictions. So they couldn't go to Brooklyn, right, for example. And so not only did the administration not limit the Iranian delegation, at least there's no indication publicly that they did, nor did they put any travel limitations on their visas. Again, they could have done all this stuff in private, not communicated, but there's been nothing said about it publicly, so I doubt that they have. What's really important is to note is that the people that are coming over are the people who are actively overseeing plots to assassinate the last president and the last administration officials. So these are my friends, right? This is my former boss, Mike Pompeo, Robert O'Brien, the national security advisor, the national security advisor before him, Brian Hook, who was one of my dearest friends and our Iran envoy. And these people, the threats have gotten worse, by the way. The administration has had to up their security, and it has not gotten better over the past 18 months during the failed negotiating attempts to get back to the JCPOA. It's actually gotten worse, way worse. And so you allow, and by the way, it's not just former administration officials. We have Masih Alinejad in New York, who I think there's at least 2 assassination attempts on her from the regime that they've caught. Iranian, I believe she's an American now, but definitely Iranian woman living in New York who's a very outspoken activist. So it's incredibly scary that the Iranians were allowed into the country to be protected by NYPD and the US Secret Service while they're trying to kill American officials. Unconscionable. So I have spent probably more of my life and my career on Iran than any single thing. China is probably the next thing. It's there. I mean, there's so much to go on there. I have a podcast coming out tomorrow, One Decision podcast, where I argue for 45 minutes on this deal. So if you don't get enough of me talking about Iran today, you can listen to that tomorrow. I talk about it a lot. I actually think, maybe I'm being naive on this because I spend so much time on it. I do think Americans care about the Iran deal when you explain it to them. And I do think the administration knows it. And that's one of the reasons why they're not back in the Iran deal right now, because I think they know we've already, people like me have already made a huge issue out of it on television and in written form, op-eds. I have another op-ed that'll come out either tomorrow or Friday in the Wall Street Journal actually on this. So you guys should be looking for that. But I find when I go on the stump and I explain that Iran, as declared by both Republican and Democratic administrations, are the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. So this is not a designation by Morgan Ortagus or by Donald Trump. This is a designation by Republican and Democratic administrations that they are the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. And when you explain to people that we have the Middle East, right? We've got Israel, our greatest ally and friend. We also have the Gulf Arab states, which are friends. And then we have this other guy over here who's the biggest, baddest terrorist. And what we're going to do is have policies that will punish our allies and friends and reward our enemy. People go, all right, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And I think, it's not just Republicans, by the way. I mean, thank God, for Senator Menendez and for many, they maybe not have been as outspoken about it, but we have definitely heard from more moderate Democrats that they were starting to get incredibly concerned about the possibility of Biden signing a really bad deal. And they were worried that Republicans would make hay out of it, which we would, because it is dangerous for American national security. It's dangerous for our ally Israel. And it's important to note that the deal that they are trying to, who knows where it currently is in Vienna. I mean, I think it's dead, but I would not be surprised if they try to revive it after the election. I would not be surprised at all. I think they're probably trying to keep their head down to the election because they know we'll pound them if they go back into it. Because the deal that they're negotiating is actually weaker than the first deal. And the first deal, as all of us know on this call, did not prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It's a flat out lie when they say it. I don't know why they lie. I don't get it. It's like even Democrats, like, don't take my word for it. Take Schumer's word for it or Menendez's word for it, right? When they say that the deal does not prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, it didn't. And even Democrats admit that. And why they continue to lie about that, I will never understand. I mean, it's like quantifiable, right? You just look, there's sunset provisions, right? I didn't make this up. It's like the deal that you guys wrote. And so when you look at, again, when you look at Blinken's testimony to become Secretary of State, he said that he was going to negotiate a longer and stronger deal, in which I said, okay. I mean, like, I didn't think he was ever going to get to that, but so if you could actually get the Iranians to negotiate with you on a deal that included ballistic missile, included their support for terrorism, included the fact that, they need to stop threatening to annihilate Israel every other day, that could be interesting if you could get them to live up to that. They couldn't. Not only could they not get a longer and stronger deal, they couldn't even get something that was as strong as the 2015 deal, which was also incredibly weak. And so for the life of me, I don't kind of get it, because they lost all of their, they squandered, I would say, all the leverage that we gave them through the maximum economic pressure campaign. Their economy were on the ropes. Their people were protesting through their own incompetence. They had incredibly mismanaged COVID. People were unhappy. The Iranian people were certainly unhappy about being lied to about the downed Ukrainian airliner. Everybody will remember that. That happened early 2020. Yeah, I think it wasn't long after Soleimani. But then everything sort of got drowned out by COVID. So anyway, saying all that, we handed the Biden administration a lot of leverage. We handed them, peace deals, the Abraham Accords. I thought we were at 5, but then Jared said yesterday 6. So I was trying to think of which one was the 6th one. But that's the problem that we had in the Trump administration. We had so many peace deals between Israel and the Arab states that we actually started to lose count, which is amazing. And then obviously we had a ton of leverage against the regime, and this administration has squandered that leverage because they're weak. They don't know how to go negotiate, and they're weak, and the Iranians know it, and they played them for the fool.
Superb answer. You have a lot packed in there. Can you let everybody know? No, that was great. Can you let everybody know where they can find the podcast?
Yes, it is the One Decision podcast. So I think if you just go into your Apple Store or whatever it is, and or your podcast app on your phone, it's called One Decision. I think it's supposed to be out tomorrow, in which I will argue with a British journalist for 45 minutes about Iran and Israel. And so, that should be mildly entertaining for some of you.
Fun stuff, fun stuff. And as far as going back to, you also, Morgan interviewed Jared Kushner on the Abraham Accords yesterday. And I did see today that I believe the Indonesians and Israel are having some sort of secret meeting. So that might follow on. I think had Trump been in office, we probably would have seen the Saudis as well. Now, instead, the Saudis are also talking to Iran. So
but you know what's beautiful about, I read that report, and I don't know anything beyond the report that you and I read on the Indonesians. What's beautiful about all of this is it's not led by America, right? This is led by Israel and by other countries, and they're, listen, I'm sure we're encouraging it, but this is not this isn't something the Biden administration is doing. This is something that, other countries realize the success and the importance of having a relationship with Israel now, and they're getting on board. That's pretty amazing.
Okay, so let's talk about Israel. Many years ago, an up-and-coming politician asked me to write a policy paper on why Israel was a strategic asset to the United States. A little more than a decade later, at a time when we're witnessing the Democrat Party move further and further away from Israel, with some Democrat representatives wishing to end U.S. funding of Iron Dome and even completely cutting off all military support to Israel, do you think it's possible to make Americans understand the national security benefits of supporting our greatest ally in the Middle East? And if not the entire world for that matter? There was an article that Mark Dubowitz of FDD wrote that was entitled "How North Korea Taught Iran to Entrap and Threaten Israel." And he wrote, quote, "It is extraordinarily difficult, however, for Israel to try to do what is necessary." And in this context, Mark is referring to whatever is necessary to protect itself, whether military or otherwise. When the Americans and the Europeans, the Jewish state's most important allies, are augmenting the treasury and abetting the nuclear quest of an enemy that has built its foreign policy and defining rhetoric on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. One would think after the North Korean experiment, after the frightfulness of the 20th century, Westerners would have more foresight and backbone, end quote. It seems to me that Americans never learn from their mistakes. And despite Trump's maximum pressure campaign, which you made reference to, that was working, Biden reversed it. But we have Israel, our greatest ally, and we need to keep them empowered. Are the candidates you're speaking to, or the politicians you're speaking to, do you think Americans understand generally, just how important our relationship is with Israel?
I do. I worry that it's becoming partisan. I'm grateful for the Republican support. I'm grateful that our party is pretty steadfast when it comes to voting for Israel, except for a few annoying outliers. But I don't think it is good for the state of Israel to have support along party lines. We're obviously a two-party country, so we need more people in the Democratic Party supporting them. And I think that Biden is sort of an old school Democrat. In that sense, that he is, very supportive of Israel. I worry about what comes after him. I don't know how much Kamala Harris is going to support Israel. I don't know. I mean, her husband's Jewish, maybe. I don't know. But it's certainly not the energy of the Democratic Party. I will say one of the things that's been really encouraging to me is some of I won't name any names, but I've been briefing a lot of candidates. And some of the candidates that I was worried about, because maybe they have taken a little bit more isolationist approach to foreign policy. And I was worried that they, how are they going to be on Israel? They totally get it. And they've been great on Israel and said a lot of supportive things. And so I feel pretty good. I feel really good about the Republican candidates coming in, their support of Israel. Less so on the Democratic side, just because I don't have access to them. I don't brief them. I don't know them as well. But it does appear that AIPAC has been pretty successful with their PAC in some of these primaries, which is, they're doing the Lord's work by, winning some of these primaries. So good for them. But as you and I were talking, I think right before this podcast, Lori, I just got back from Israel. I was there last week, actually in an AIPAC-led bipartisan delegation. And I actually got to see Iron Dome up close. I think I have my hat right now, my Iron Dome hat.
Oh, that's awesome.
I love swag.
Very
I was
cool.
really excited for the swag. So we actually did a tour of the facility and got to see the Iron Dome launcher. So that was incredibly cool. And I got to do a few things that I'd never done before. I went up to the Golan Heights, which I missed that trip with Pompeo because I was in my third trimester and no one wanted me to travel.
Yeah.
So I finally got to see that. We went into a Hezbollah tunnel and had a lot of really great meetings. But there's definitely a sense. I would tell you, my observation from being on the ground is there's definitely a sense that perhaps something's about to pop off in the West Bank or potentially with Lebanese Hezbollah. And so one of the things that I'm doing actually is getting on a Zoom later today with a bunch of candidates and campaigns to explain to them what I think is happening in Israel and how to talk about it if that does indeed happen.
That's so important. I love that you're doing that. I don't know whatever happened with the policy paper I wrote, but I do think that Americans sometimes forget that Israel is really a strategic asset to the U.S. That it's not just Israel that benefits from our relationship, but we benefit from the relationship with Israel as well.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean that's right. The support that they have with us in the fight against terrorism. I mean, it's a multifaceted relationship. Obviously, even on I'm a little bit more focused on the military realm, but the intel sharing, the support on military technologies and other technologies. I mean, it's crucial, and it's very important.
When Russia first invaded Ukraine, we were treated to 24/7 news stories, videos, photos of the atrocities that the Russians were committing. While Americans on both sides of the aisle, it wasn't a partisan issue, were planting lawn signs declaring that they stand with Ukraine. That was what I would consider an emotional response. But I'd like you to discuss the reality of why Americans should vote for representatives who take a hard line on Russia, and why the current American leadership has failed to deter Putin, as did Obama when Putin invaded Crimea.
Mm-hmm.
Why should we care about
Yeah.
Russia?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, crazy news coming out of Russia today, right? You see what, it's a massive sign of weakness with Putin, calling up his countrymen. I think I'd have to look at the details of who it's going to be, but I think it's anybody with some sort of prior military background is now going to be called up. And you wonder just how long Russians are going to be willing to be in that fight. So, Putin has done himself in many ways, with this, and we should give, I was in Ukraine in May, in Lviv, and we should give credit to the brave Ukrainian fighters. I mean, these are people that were knew that they were David, knew they had a Goliath, and they were going to fight Goliath no matter what. And so it's a listen, for the thousands dead, right? It's a tragedy that this even happened in the first place. As you correctly stated, the Biden administration, Biden himself failed to deter Putin. He said that was his stated goal, that they wanted to deter Russia from invading in Ukraine. I think, unfortunately, for the Biden team, they were the same people that were in charge in the Obama administration whenever Russia invaded Crimea. And so it's not like it was a lot of new faces and names. It was people that Putin already knew and knew what he could get away with, which I think is why, he ultimately made the gamble, a bad gamble, and invaded. We also should not, there's a lot of, I've seen a lot of stuff in the press where the administration is, trying to take some credit for what's happening, on the ground. Listen, they've slow walked the aid at every point. They've slow walked the sanctions. They should have been giving Ukraine, how many thousands of lives would have been saved if they would have been giving Ukraine this equipment before Russia invaded? Instead, they waited till afterwards. So any sort of quarterbacking that they've done, such a, Monday morning quarterbacking that, about this amazing job that they've done in Ukraine is ridiculous. In fact, there's thousands of people have dead that didn't need to be had they properly deterred the Russians. And it's important because obviously we all see Taiwan looming large, and we see the Chinese Communist Party taking notes, looking they're looking at who did what in every turn, and the Ukrainians need a lot of success right now because we don't know, how bad this winter is going to get. We don't know how desperate Putin is going to get. So while there are always moments in this war where it's precarious. And I should say there's always moments in this war where the Ukrainians start doing really well and the Russians do poorly and everyone gets really excited, not to be the bearer of bad news, but, this Putin is not going down without a fight and it'll get really ugly on the way down. And, the Ukrainians might fight to the last soul, Putin might try that as well. I don't think that the Russians are as motivated to fight by any means as the average Ukrainian is, but this is going to get a lot more messy before it's over.
Yeah, I think that people are very concerned about Putin's desperation and what tactics he will use to save face and save power, because if he loses this, he's out of power and he possibly dead. But I think that with regard to the Ukraine war, again, that's one more example of failed foreign policy that has an impact domestically. We look at, we can't blame Putin on the cost of gas when we go to fill up our cars, as the Biden administration would like us to, but certainly it's had an impact on energy prices, supply chains, bread, fertilizer. So there's a lot there that could have been different had it been handled from the Biden administration standpoint differently.
Absolutely.
So I have one more question for you before we go to the Q&A. And again, everybody that wants to ask Morgan a question, you can put it in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As the U.S. withdraws from the world stage and the bad guys become empowered, we see all sorts of new alliances forming. The powerful Pax Americana that had kept relative peace and stability in the Middle East and surrounding areas was decimated by Obama. And now we see Russia back in the region after decades of being forced out. We've got Russia, China, and Iran, in a new alliance, an evil axis. They're working together. The Saudis are talking with Iran. North Korea and Iran have a relationship. And generally our enemies seem to be allying together, while we kind of seem to not be, paying too much attention to it. Will it take another world war for Americans to wake up to the fact that we really aren't secure? I mean, clearly we've got inflation, supply chain issues, fentanyl deaths, energy shortages and prices skyrocketing, illegal aliens pouring over our open border who become dependents on our welfare system while bringing with them crime, drugs, and other things. So we've got these domestic issues we understand now that are directly related to foreign policy, but I fear that Americans are too complacent in terms of the way they see national security. So short of war, and I mean a war that we're involved with, do you think that we can get Americans to focus on the importance of national security when they're voting?
So if you look at the polling, and when you go cycle by cycle, certainly Americans are more engaged whenever there is an attack, when there's a war, there's something like that. But I think you've really hit the nail on the head in the discussion, in that the domestic issues, when we look at the polling, at the top things that people, that voters care about, it's obviously inflation. Jobs in the economy is number 2, and then the border is number 3. And the border is our most important national security issue. I was just there last month with about 8 or 9 women who are running for federal office, seeing firsthand the just inhumane and cruel policies of the Biden administration. And I actually called it a war on Latinas, on the women, on the teenage girls. I mean, absolutely horrific what they're going through. So when you look at all of these issues going on, I think that what people like me and you, Lori, what we all have to do is continue to connect foreign policy to the issues that voters care most about. And it's happens to be really easy to do so when you look at the 3 things that I just laid out that voters care about most. And so it's always going to be a challenge, because when you start talking about the world, sometimes it can be intimidating, or sometimes people's eyes glaze over. But I think the more that we have these discussions, the more, like with Polaris, for example, one of the things that I'm doing is working with our Senate candidates around the country to do hour-long foreign policy discussions. And so they're actually taking time off the campaign trail to do this, which I'm quite proud of. So I mentioned that we had the border event last month where I took women down there. A few weeks ago, I was in Pittsburgh with Dr. Oz, and was able to bring together him and Dave McCormick for the first time since that primary. And also on the stage joined us was former DNI Director of National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe, who was also a former member of Congress. And so the 4 of us sat on stage for an hour, wasn't campaign, wasn't red meat. We just talked about foreign policy. And I think people were incredibly engaged. And it really gave McCormick and Oz a moment to come together on something incredibly serious. And we did exactly what I'm doing now with you, Lori, and everybody on this call. We talked about foreign policy, why it matters, and how it's tied into domestic issues. So it may not always be, as sexy of a headline as some of the domestic stuff, but I think I've had somewhat success in trying to get it out there and make it a campaign issue.
Yeah, I think that's terrific. And I'm going to try to put a link in the chat to an article on the event that you held in Pittsburgh. I think it was terrific to get McCormick and Oz on the same stage. As you said, that was the first time that the two of them been together. And it was really, I think, amazing that McCormick was willing to get on stage with him.
We have at least 2 more, maybe 3 or 4 more of those Senate, those national security conversations, Polaris national security conversations happening before the election. We are getting ready to announce 2 of them, I think, next week. So I can't say the names yet, but you can, by process of elimination, you can probably figure out what Senate races I'm focusing on.
That's amazing. I am going to try to put this into the chat. So I will, I'll ask you a question, then I'll get the link to the article in the chat for those interested. So someone asked, do you see Turkey under Erdogan as an asset or liability in the Eastern Mediterranean? Turkey is often referred to as NATO in name only. Do you see them staying in NATO long-term?
I think so. Mostly because there's no process to kick them out, and nor do I think, they want the F-16s more than anything. So they want our military hardware. And, keep in mind, Turkey and everyone else are watching as, Russia fails spectacularly and their equipment fails in Ukraine. So if anything else, Russia's disastrous, Putin's disastrous miscalculation in Ukraine is probably a boon for U.S. military sales whenever you see how the Russians are performing. So I think Turkey is an incredibly complicated one. It's actually one of the most complicated foreign policy bilateral relationships that we have anywhere in the world, I think, because on one hand, they are a part of NATO. We need them. There's some things that Turkey does for us that it's not in the public domain that I can't talk about, that it's really crucial. But then they do other things that are infuriating to us. Like they were at the, the meetings in Asia last week with Putin and Xi, and the Indians were there. I think the Iranians were there as well. Although Putin did get a little embarrassed at those meetings, right? I think both Modi, Prime Minister in India, and Xi Jinping, there were public admissions of the Russians not doing so well, right? And Ukraine, perhaps, that it wasn't helpful. So I think Putin got a little embarrassed on the world stage at that event last week. So yes, our enemies may be combining and getting together, but this is why it's ever more important for the Europeans to actually be in the fight with us. And we have to spend a lot of our time focusing on our Indo-Pacific relationships. There's something called the Quad that happened, that was put together at the end of the Bush administration and laid dormant for most of the Obama administration. And then we revived in the Trump administration, and Mike Pompeo spent a lot of time investing in those Quad relationships. And so, we have to make sure that our allies and friends in the Indo-Pacific are airtight, right? You never win the struggle on your own. You have to do it with people in the region and the people that understand the threat of the kind. Chinese Communist Party are its neighbors, right? They understand it better than anybody. So I don't know if I answered Turkey. Sorry, I went off on China where you had asked me about Turkey. Back to Turkey. So listen, I do think it's important that Turkey's in NATO. They have so many things that irritate me about them. I get very annoyed when I see them holding hands with Putin, at that meeting. At the same time, they were very helpful to us in many ways in the fight against ISIS. I would rather bring them into the fold than kick them out. There's days that I want to kick them out, but I think that their relationship is important, and it's shades of gray, right? Very often, or not very often, I should say, do we have black and white issues in foreign policy? It's often shades of gray, and that's where the Turks lie. I was happy to see that they've, established a new relationship, or not new, but, have reestablished relationships with Israel. That was positive.
Very, very. Can you also say what the link is to Polaris, people, if they want to follow
Sure.
your activities?
So first of all, you can catch me, my social media. I'm on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Truth Social. Everything I believe is at Morgan Ortagus. So you see how my name is spelled. It's my last name's a little tricky. And then Polaris, our website is, so it's POLARIS -us.org. And so if you go to any of my social media, so I think most of our Polaris social media is at Polaris, POLARIS, NAT, NAT, SEC, SEC. That's I think how you can find us. And if nothing else, I in my bio of all my social media, I tag all the Polaris handles. And you can go to our website. And we do have a mailing list. Actually, Will is on, I think. And if not, Will, we need to make sure this has happened. I think you can sign up for my mailing list on the website. I do not spam. Actually, we only send things out a couple times a month. And when we do send out messaging on foreign policy, it's really good when we do it because we don't spam.
And Naomi put some of that information in the chat if everybody wants to.
Thank you.
There. Yeah, thanks, Naomi. So we have time for just a couple more questions. Somebody asked what the Biden administration's rationale for a new Iran deal is, that it'll give them, hundreds of millions of dollars, and they're the biggest supporter and leader of terrorism. So I think people for a long time have been trying to get their head around this. Do you have any insight on, do they really think it's going to stop them? We know it's not going to stop a nuclear deal. So,
I think some of them think it does. I don't know why they think that. I think part of it's emotional. It's like they thought that they solved world peace. In fact, they just made the Middle East a lot more unstable with that deal. And enraged our allies and friends in the region. So I think a lot of it's emotional. I think that, Obama and his team used almost all of their foreign policy political capital to get this deal done, right? They went after sitting Democrat senators who opposed them. They were ferocious in order to get this through. I think they had a wrong view of the Middle East. They thought, here was the gamble. Here's what they were trying to do. They thought if we had all these sanctions on Iran, if we can get to a deal with them on the nuclear weapon, we can kick the can down the road and maybe the nuke won't be built for 15 years. So only politicians, by the way, consider it a success when you make an intractable problem someone else's problem, right? When you kick the can down the road to the next administration, that's a success. Okay. I think solving problems is a success, not making it someone else's problem. Anyway, I think that they thought, over this 10 to 15 year process of the, the sunset provisions, Iran, they thought they could moderate the regime's behavior, right? Which I fundamentally disagree with. I think that this is a, theocratic, revolutionary regime, and there are not moderates in this regime. It's a joke, right? To say that there are. But they thought, okay, we're going to empower the moderates, with this deal. And we're going to open up so that Europe and America can do business with Iran. And as Iran does more business with the rest of the world, they will moderate, right? They will stop their support for terrorism, and they'll want to be a normal nation and a part of the, community of nations. That it's just beyond naive. And beyond, and in fact, all they did was give billions of dollars in sanctions relief. They essentially, Iran had a match to light the Middle East on fire, and we threw gasoline on it with the billions of dollars in sanctions relief. So it didn't work, and not only did it not work, we proved it didn't work, because when we withdrew from the deal, when we went to the maximum economic pressure campaign, we started bringing together Israel and the Arab states, who, no one ever thought that there would be peace deals ever. I thought maybe this would happen at the end of my career, not in the middle of it. And so we proved that the way they saw the Middle East was wrong. And so that's emotional for people, right? Whenever you stake your whole career on an Iran deal and you're wrong, and not only you're wrong, you're really publicly wrong when we get peace deals out of taking the opposite position. And so I think a lot of it's emotional, that they want to go back into the deal because it was Obama's deal and because Trump withdrew and they have Trump derangement syndrome. I don't know how you look at the past few years in the Middle East and see the success of putting pressure on Iran and see the success of the Abraham Accords and think to yourself, no, what would be better is if we empower the enemy again. It's just stupid. I'm sorry.
No, it's frightening. We have another at least 2 years of this. So That's why the midterm elections are
That's
so
right.
important, bringing that back to where we started. It's 1:00, so we're going to have to go. And I'm sorry for the people that posted questions that I did not get to. But Morgan, as always, you're terrific. And I can't
Thank
thank
you.
you enough for joining us today. I want to wish everybody a Shana Tova, all good things in the coming year. Happy, healthy, sweet things. Thank you, Morgan.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Lori. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.